when I first was trained to play different bow directions, I remember being, they slapped the big Simandl book down, and my dad had me read through the first couple pages of whole notes going to half notes, going to quarter notes, and it wasn't really addressed some of the more subtle nuances, probably because I was just trying to figure out how not to drop the bow and things like that. But eventually, you start out with slow notes, and eventually you start chopping them into tinier pieces until finally you have very fast notes. And that really is a good way of thinking of it, because all a fast note is a tiny cross-section of a long note. Now that we've basically kind of figured out how to hold on to this stick with hair that we call a bow, we kind of have to experiment with the way the actual instrument responds when we put the hair on the string. And there are several variables that you have to take into account. One of them is the distance from the bridge. If you play right on top of the bridge, they call it ponticello, which I think might even literally mean on the bridge. And it gets this distortion guitar type sound. So you have close to the bridge. That's one variable. Then the other two variables are the weight you're applying to the string with your arm, and then the speed at which you're going to pull the string in either direction. And those three are complementary. If you change one, oftentimes if you want to maintain a similar sound, you have to change the other two proportionately. And that's a tricky thing. Anytime you add an extra variable, you go from algebra to calculus all of a sudden, and it becomes very complicated. So it's good to kind of start experimenting with a single bolt placement. Try a given weight and a given speed, maybe cut both in half at the same placement from the bridge, and you'll find that all of a sudden you've been able to change the volume considerably, but the tone more or less remains the same. If you want to change the tone a lot, I find a lot of times you can move the distance from the bridge, and farther from the bridge will get a more whispery tone, under the breath they call it, sotto voce, literally under the breath. And this is a beautiful sound, and it can be used to great effect in solo playing and orchestral playing all the time. If you really want to send shivers up people's spine, just lightly pull the bow and do it over the fingerboard. At the same time, you can go the opposite direction, and in general, to get a similar type of sound and a response, when you go closer to the bridge, you're going to have to cut your speed down. The bow speed will have to be much slower in order to not play a ponticello type sound. It's also much harder to start the string. But you can see how slow my bow is moving. Now if I wanted that to be a more aggressive sound, more obnoxious, I could simply add a lot more weight. You can see me flattening out the ribbon of hair onto the string right there. And you can see how that gets a very harsh sound. If I don't put as much weight on it, then I can get a ponticello sound. Sometimes when you're playing in different music, it will require you to change the length of your string by moving up to a much higher note on the bass. And in essence what you did is you just made your string much shorter. In general, if you want to maintain a similar sound, the distance from the bridge has to remain the same in relationship to the length of string. So as the string gets shorter, your right hand, the bow placement, is going to have to be at the same proportion of the string. So let's say my bow is at 1/10 of my whole string length. Well, as the string length shrinks, I want to keep it at 1/10, which means it gets closer to the bridge. Because of the phenomenon of in order to maintain a similar tone with a given bow placement, when you're going up, sometimes you have to go from a note that's very high to a note that's very low, and you want to keep the same tone, but you can't keep exactly the same bow placement because all of a sudden you're jumping from a short string to a very long string. And this is why God invented these three different aspects to creating the sound on the bass. Because what you can do is, when you want to keep this sound up here, you can actually maintain the same bow placement, and by changing the weight and bow speed, you can kind of hide the fact that you didn't change your placement. You can see I'm moving the bow much slower, and I'm using very little weight, even though my bow placement is closer to the bridge than I would really want for that note. In the same way that the length of the string affects the way you're going to use your bow, and the placement from the bridge affects the way all these other things relate to each other, the thickness of the string also changes things. I find that on a thicker string, I tend to have to move my bow slower at a given distance from the bridge than I would, say, on this string. And you can see the difference. On this string, to get the same tone, I was moving a much faster bow. A lot of players just learn naturally to compensate for this. If they want to hold a note very long, they're going to move closer to the bridge and lighten up the weight and try to mask the fact that they're closer to the bridge. And on the low string, it's nice because you don't have to. It's much harder to play right next to the bridge, so you kind of learn how to play farther, or with a slower bow speed.